The victory of the Emperor over Horus at the Siege of Terra shattered the unity of the Chaos Gods and prevented them from ruling the galaxy through their human puppets. The sudden death of their greatest champion had weakened their hold on the mortal realm. Their demonic forces had been cast back into the Imperium, and the traitor legions had fled the throne world. Yet, despite their failure to overthrow the Emperor, the traitors still held vast swaths of the galaxy under their control. It was for this reason that, even as the Emperor's shattered body was interred within the Golden Throne, he gave a final order to his loyal Primarchs. The traitors were to be driven from the stars and cast for all eternity into the hell of the Eye of Terror. As the Primarchs on Terra gathered before the silent, living corpse that was their father, their need for vengeance burned bright. The 9 remaining loyal Space Marine legions, led by the Ultramarines and the Space Wolves, immediately unleashed themselves upon the retreating Chaos forces. The Loyalists' task was made easier, since the traitor legions were no longer able to act as a unified military in Horus's absence. The servants of Chaos now fought each other as often as they faced the enemy. During the course of the campaign, remembered as the Great Scouring, the Loyalists began to realize the true extent of Chaos's influence on mankind. World after world was discovered to be afflicted by the presence of cultists who worshiped the dark gods. They hid like parasites wherever human weakness gave them opportunity. And though the demons of Chaos had been badly weakened by Horus's death, the loyal Astartes still faced those summoned horrors of the warp in battle after battle. The Ultramarines played a crucial role in the battles of the Scouring. They had been unable to reach Terra in time to take part in its defense, delayed by their battles in the Galactic East and the difficulties of navigating the warp as the Ruin Storm finally dissipated. This left the 13th Legion as the largest of the remaining loyal Space Marine forces, and their Primarch Roboute Guilliman as the Imperium's greatest general. There was also little doubt that Guilliman remained the greatest military strategist in the Imperium. He took it upon himself to rally his remaining brothers and their legions to act as the avengers of their father, and a bulwark against the enemies of the Imperium. The days immediately following the end of the heresy were said to be some of the darkest seen for humanity since the Age of Strife. Guilliman seemed to be everywhere during the Scouring, finding every weak point in the Imperial offensive and reinforcing them with the Ultramarines before moving on to the next battle zone. At no time did the Imperial forces retreat, as their faith in Guilliman and the Emperor's cause proved unshakable. In truth, Guilliman himself was driven to lead not only by his own need for vengeance, but by a gnawing sense of guilt. In his heart, the Primarch believed that if he had only arrived at Terra a few hours earlier, the Emperor might have emerged from his encounter with Horus unharmed. Then the Master of Mankind could have continued his pursuit of a new golden age for humanity, rather than leaving his children to face the darkness alone. The fighting continued for many years before the last of the traitor forces were expelled from Imperial space. As the Emperor had expected, most of the surviving traitor forces took up refuge in the Eye of Terror. They chose to live in that twilight domain between real space and the warp, where the Loyalists could not pursue them for fear of corruption by Chaos. During this time, the Loyalists also repelled countless Xenos incursions that had taken advantage of the Imperial Civil War to plague human planets. At the end of the Scouring, Guilliman took stock of a galaxy devastated by war. Tens of billions were dead, and the reconstruction would take decades, if not centuries. Though the Imperium had withstood its greatest test, the Primarch knew that its institutions needed to be reformed if such a tragedy was to be prevented from ever happening again. A master of organization, Guilliman also set into motion what was remembered as the Reformation of the Imperium, reshaping its military and government to protect against future betrayals. His first target was the Space Marine legions themselves. Each legion was like a knife held to the throat of the Imperium. Their concentration of military power was so great that if their loyalty faltered, there was little that could stand against them, except for another legion of Astartes. Guilliman decided that each legion needed to be divided into much smaller units known as chapters. Each chapter would also then be governed by a new set of regulations intended to reduce the variance in legion cultures that had helped to bring on the heresy. These regulations were contained in Guilliman's greatest work, the tome known as the Codex Astartes. The Codex was intended to govern every aspect of a chapter's military organization, from recruitment to battlefield tactics to how unit marking should be displayed. The Codex also restored the corps of librarians to the new chapters, due to the necessity for imperial psychers that had been proven by the events of the heresy. The Codex was later embraced by the majority of chapters, but especially by those related to the Ultramarines, as an almost sacred text. But perhaps the Codex's most significant change was the downsizing of the Space Marine legions. Where the typical legion could number more than 100,000 Astartes, each chapter was to be limited to only 1,000, with each of the original legions divided as many times as required into successor chapters. One of these chapters retained the name and identity of its original legion. The others claimed the same genetic origin as their founding Primarch, but they developed their own distinctive culture and customs over time. This division, remembered as the second founding of the Space Marines, or the Adeptus Astartes as they were now called, was undertaken 7 years after the end of the heresy. Many of the Primarchs at first resisted the second founding, refusing to see their battle-tested brotherhoods divided. Some, like Rogel Dorn, even seemed to be willing to risk another civil war over the matter. However, the hardships of the Scouring and the sheer extent of chaos corruption in the Imperium eventually convinced most that Guilliman's new direction was the wisest course. Changes were also made to the other Imperial armed forces. The second-line garrison forces of the Imperial Army were split into 2 separate organizations, the Astra Militarum and the Imperial Navy. The link between them was broken, so that the ground troop commanders of the Astra Militarum and the flag officers of the Imperial Navy would have no authority over each other. In this way, no force could transport itself across the galaxy without the cooperation of a rival military service and its different chain of command. The Astra Militarum, also called the Imperial Guard, was guided by its own manual of tactics and strategies that was often treated as Holy Writ, the Tactica Imperium. Additionally, the Astra Militarum replaced the Space Marine legions as the Imperium's frontline military forces. The new, smaller Space Marine chapters were to be reserved for the roles of planetary assault and to serve as Imperial Special Forces. The ordinary men and women of the Imperial Guard would now stand as humanity's primary line of defense against a hostile galaxy. Guilliman also reformed the Imperial government, combining the Council of Terra and the original ruling War Council into a single Imperial bureaucracy called the Adeptus Terra. This organization was further subdivided into a number of different branches known as Adeptas, which soon created vast bureaucracies of their own. Among the new organizations was the Adeptus Mechanicus, formed before the heresy had ended by those tech priests of the original Mechanicum who had stayed loyal to the Emperor. They retained their monopoly over all Imperial technology in the New Order and pledged themselves to the Omnissiah, who had finally become one with the machine that was the Golden Throne. With the Emperor immobilized and Malcador dead, Guilliman vested the executive power of the Imperium in a new council called the Senatorum Imperialis, which was comprised of the High Lords of Terra. These imperial nobles included the Master of the Adeptus Administratum, the Imperium's chief bureaucrat, the new Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Master of the Astronomicon, the Master of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and the Paternoval Envoy of the Navigator families. Guilliman joined the council as its leader, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, who served as the Supreme Imperial Military Commander. With this new structure, the entire bureaucracy of the reformed Imperium would have knowledge of Imperial military actions and be able to coordinate them more effectively. But Guilliman unexpectedly added one more seat to the Council of High Lords. This was for the representative of the Imperium's newest organization, the secret police force later called the Inquisition. During the Horus Heresy, the Emperor had commanded Malcador the Sigillite to seek out men and women of an inquisitive bent. They were to be tested and trained to serve as an elite group of warriors and investigators dedicated to rooting out chaos corruption wherever they found it in the galaxy. The Sigillite ultimately found 12 worthy champions for the Emperor to approve. 4 were mortal lords and administrators, and 8 were Space Marines drawn from both the Loyalist and Traitor Legions. The Space Marines' true loyalties had been determined during the Horus Heresy, when they had served the Sigillite as the covert Astartes agents known as Knights Errant. In the days just before the start of the Siege of Terra, these chosen few were split into 2 groups. The 4 mortals were tasked with founding the organization of the Imperium-wide Inquisition. The 8 Space Marines traveled to Saturn's moon of Titan through an ancient webway gate. At Titan, the chosen Space Marines discovered a fortress monastery had already been prepared for them and stocked with everything needed to create a new army of Space Marines. This included supplies of gene seed, which had been engineered from the Emperor's own genome directly, rather than from one of the Primarchs. A vast supply of weapons and vehicles were provided by a secret branch of the Mechanicus, which had been established on the former moon of Mars called Deimos. Through the use of arcane technologies, Malcador had seen Deimos teleported into orbit of Titan. The fortress on Titan was also already populated by hundreds of recruits who had been raised from across the galaxy. Some were still mortal, waiting to be transformed into transhuman Astartes, but others had been taken in secret from the Loyalist Space Marine Legions. This new Space Marine force was intended to be smaller than a full legion, another chapter like those created by Guilliman in the Second Founding. It was named the Grey Knights, in honor of its founder's service as Knights Errant, and the unadorned gray power armor they wore as a sign of their spiritual purity. One of these Astartes was named by Malcador as the first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. This warrior, Janus, had discarded his old name and identity for this new life in the Emperor's service, like all of his brethren. Before he left Titan, Malcador used his potent psychic abilities to hide Titan away from Horus's invasion of the Sol system in the most unlikely of places, the warp itself. The world was protected by macro Geller fields and defensive psychic sigils and rites while the last days of the Horus Heresy played out in real space. Titan eventually returned to the mortal realm, just as the Second Founding was taking place. In the warp, time had passed far faster than in real space, and so the Grey Knights returned as a chapter of 1,000 fully trained Space Marines. They were immediately contacted secretly by the 4 mortal leaders of the Inquisition, who designated them Chapter 666 and began to deploy them on highly classified missions to protect humanity from new demonic incursions. The Grey Knights were the Emperor's final gift to humanity. The chapter was an attempt to correct those mistakes that had led to the Horus Heresy by creating a body of Space Marines who were both specially prepared to battle chaos and were incorruptible by it. While every Grey Knight was a powerful psyker, each was also blessed with gene seed derived from the Emperor himself. This provided a level of spiritual purity that was unmatched by any other human being, combined with the superhuman combat abilities of an Astartes. Like the Emperor himself, a Grey Knight's psychic presence was anathema to beings of the warp. This rendered them unpalatable to the dark appetites of demons, and thus immune to their attempts at moral corruption. Grey Knights were trained to channel their psychic powers into a halo of protective wards called the Aegis, and to unleash potent combat abilities. The power of a Grey Knight's pure soul could be unleashed as a cleansing flame, a burst of white light, or some other manifestation of purity. The mightiest of the Grey Knights could banish demons with a single touch, restore the courage of Imperial armies who faced the terrors of demonic invasion, or even physically enter the warp to bring the fight to the home realm of the Chaos Gods. The Grey Knights were ultimately the most potent tool of the mortal-led Inquisition. Its agents, called Inquisitors, were drawn from all walks of life. Some were low-born common laborers, while others had lived the opulent lives of Imperial nobles. What marked them all was that they were wholly human, and rarely possessed any special genetic augmentations, though some were powerful psychers. The Inquisition answered only to the High Lords of Terra, and their word was otherwise law across the galaxy. They policed themselves and chose new recruits based on criteria that differed from Inquisitor to Inquisitor. Each was an investigator without parallel, able to detect signs of corruption wherever it emerged in the galaxy. An Inquisitor was trusted with the necessary power and authority to do whatever was required to safeguard mankind, including the sacrifice of entire worlds. Most believed that sometimes the death of millions was needed to save the lives of billions. The Great Scouring wrought other major changes on the galaxy. The homeworlds of the Traitor Legions and many other worlds hopelessly corrupted by chaos were destroyed by a vengeful Imperium. The Dark Angels and Blood Angels legions successfully cleansed the Cadian sector near the Eye of Terror of all Chaos forces. After being scoured clean, Cadia itself was soon resettled by the Imperium. It was transformed into an impregnable fortress world that guarded the warp routes out of the Eye of Terror. The Traitor Legions wouldn't be allowed to return to Imperial space without a fight. The Imperial government, once held together by the sheer intellect of Malcador, had been reformed into a new structure that governed the galaxy effectively without relying on a single man. The creation of the Inquisition and the Grey Knights ensured that humanity still had a fighting chance to reclaim the galaxy, even as the Emperor's original plans were laid in ruins by Horus's rebellion. But the price paid for this second chance was steep. Even as this so-called time of rebirth began, humanity lost the leadership of its remaining demigods. Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels returned to his homeworld of Caliban after the Siege of Terra to discover that its garrison had been corrupted by chaos. He met the leader of these fallen angels, his former friend Luther, in single combat, but vanished when the world was blasted into fragments by an orbital bombardment. Jagadai Khan of the White Scars disappeared during the scouring while pursuing a force of Drukhari into the Webway. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves and Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard chose to enter the Eye of Terror on their own quests to hunt down the servants of the Chaos Gods. Vulcan of the Salamanders simply left his legion behind, promising to return one day for a final battle against chaos. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists was believed killed during the first major incursion by the Traitor Marines into Imperial space since the Horus Heresy, the First Black Crusade. And Lord Commander Roboute Guilliman, who had reshaped the Imperium to confront a galaxy where the Emperor no longer walked among humanity, was mortally wounded by his brother. At the Battle of Thessala, during the Scouring, over a century after the Siege of Terra, Guilliman confronted the corrupted Emperor's Children Legion and their demon Primarch Fulgrim. Fulgrim had been transformed by Slaanesh during the Heresy into a four-armed, serpentine demon prince. Wielding a poisoned blade, Fulgrim was able to overwhelm the Ultramarines' Primarch and slit his throat. To save his life, Guilliman was teleported away by his warriors and placed in a stasis field, frozen in time at the moment of his death. His body was transported to the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge and placed within a shrine where most believed he would remain forever. As the 31st millennium drew to its end, the passing of the last Primarch marked the true end of an era. The Emperor and his sons were gone. Humanity faced an uncertain future alone, forced to take charge of its own destiny for the first time in centuries.